Hello, good evening, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the latest forum in our Issues That Matter series. Tonight, our topic is Protecting Arkansas's Waterways, What's in Your Tap? This series is presented by the Central Arkansas Library System, the League of Women Voters of Pulaski County, and KYR 89.1. I'm Daniel Breen with KYR News. I'll be guiding the discussion this evening. This Zoom forum is being recorded for a later broadcast on KYR with our air dates to be announced, so stay tuned for that. Before I introduce our panelists for this evening, I want to give thanks to both the Central Arkansas Library System and the League of Women Voters of Pulaski County for partnering up with us for this event. I'd also like to give a brief explanation of the format for this online forum. We'll be asking our panelists a variety of questions, but we also want to hear from you, the listener, or viewer in this case, I guess. If you have a question, please use the question and answer function on Zoom. Someone on our team is also going to be monitoring our Facebook stream and our YouTube stream. So if you're watching through those, leave a question there. We'll see that as well. All right, so all of our panelists have received our topics and questions ahead of time so they can prepare, come with ideas, statistics, graphs, whatever they want to bring to the table. For each question asked, participants are free to answer questions and comment on others' input. It'll be a very informal discussion tonight, and then we'll be moving on to the next question after that. Now, please help me welcome our participants for this Issues That Matter forum. We have first up, Central Arkansas Watershed Protection Manager, Raven Lawson. There she is. And we have Little Rock Water Reclamation Authority CEO, Greg Ramone. And yes, good evening. And last but not least, we have Carolyn Sherman. She's a longtime activist in the field of watershed protection. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Looking forward to a great discussion. I'm going to start with questions in the order I introduced you all. So Raven, Greg, and then Carolyn, but then I'll be kind of switching it up each time. I would be going next question, Greg, Carolyn, then Raven, and so on and so forth. If I can successfully keep track of that, we will see. And before I start with tonight's questions, I'll just ask each of you to give us a little bit of idea of your background, tell us a little bit about yourself and what your involvement is in the world of water. And so I will start with you, Raven Lawson.
All right, thank you. Yes, I'm Raven Lawson. I'm the Watershed Protection Manager at Central Arkansas Water. I've been with the utility going on 8 years now. And before that, I had many years of work in aquatic ecology, advocacy, and education around watersheds. In my current role, me and my team are tasked with protecting what you see behind me here. That's the Lake Maumelle, as well as the Lake Winona watersheds. It's a small team of 5, but the utility actually owns about 25,000 acres of both land and water resources that we actively manage on a day in and day out basis. And we do that to ensure that those water systems are protected for future Arkansans. Right now, those 2 systems serve about 500,000 people on a day-to-day basis.
All right, thank you so much, Raven. And Greg Ramone, you're up next.
Yes, so Greg Ramone, I've been with the Little Rock Water Reclamation Authority for almost 8 years. Prior to that, I was in the Phoenix area. I was the Assistant Water Services Director for the City of Phoenix. And in that role, I was responsible for both water and wastewater. As a matter of fact, I was responsible for 7 water treatment plants with a capacity of 700 million gallons a day. I have been in the water and wastewater field for about 30 plus years, let me say. And I'm really excited to be here.
All right, well, thank you for being here. And last but not least, Carolyn Sherman.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Sherman. I'm on the board of the Friends of the Washita Trail, and we monitor the Lake Maumelle watershed because the trail goes through that area, and I'm also an adopter of trail out there. I also served on the Lake Maumelle Watershed Task Force and helped put together the land use plans that are now in use within Pulaski County to protect that watershed. I also serve on the board of the Ozark Society, and we protect the Buffalo River watershed and the Buffalo River National River, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary as of this week. So, and I'm also involved in several other conservation organizations in protecting watersheds throughout the state.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Carolyn, for joining us, and happy birthday to the Buffalo National River, of course.
Exactly.
Yes.
We
Well,
floated this week. It was beautiful.
yes, I'm sure. Well, it looks pretty good for 50. Well, first off, well, I'll start in the same order again, starting with you, Raven. First question tonight, give us your quote unquote elevator pitch on the water system. How does water get from the source to our tap, and what is your involvement in that process?
Awesome. So yeah, so when it comes to getting water to your tap, the cycle starts as soon as those raindrops fall out of the sky. And so raindrops fall out of the sky, they hit this landscape behind me, and they roll off of the landscape into these reservoirs where they collect. And so my role in all of that starts at that point. When those water droplets hit that land, we're looking at the protection of the land, the conservation of the land, and how we can best utilize the land in order to help us keep the drinking water clean and safe. And that starts with keeping healthy forest and intact forest moving forward. So the water droplets go from the reservoir, and then they go into our intake facilities on the lakes themselves. The water's carried in big pipes, taken to our treatment plants. We treat that water, and then we distribute it out to what we call the distribution system. But you may know it as the pipes in your ground and the faucets that are in your homes and things like that. And so that is really how we get that water to that treatment process. It's an act of public health more than anything, but it starts as soon as those water droplets fall out of the sky.
All right. Thank you very much, Raven. And next to Greg Ramone, again, the question, basically elevator pitch on the water system. How does it get from point A to point B? And you come up from a sort of a different stage in the process.
So Daniel, let me start off by saying, to add to what, to add to what Robin said, there is no new water. And so the water that we have just changes, and it really is important for us to protect the water. Excuse me. The water, I also don't want to stop at the point where the folks drink the water, because it really is a complete water cycle. And so water's in reservoirs, water is then treated, as Robin pointed, water is distributed. And the main point there is the water company needs to produce a safe drinking water, something that prevents people from getting sick. And if in the 1800s and 1900s, lots of people died as a result of waterborne diseases. So it's extremely important that we maintain a good watershed protection. Excuse me. But then the process continues. So it's when you flush the toilet, it's when you take a shower, that water needs to be protected as well. So you can't just dispose of that water into the river the way it is. Otherwise, it would pollute the river and obviously kill the fish and the vegetation that's around. So the water then has to be treated. We have 3 wastewater treatment facilities. We refer to them as water reclamation facilities. We reclaim the water, and we do it with a biological process. So it's a very natural process. It really is what nature does, except for we do it in a much faster form. And once that's done, then of course the water is released into the Arkansas River. We end up with 3 things. We end up with really clean water, the water that's about 7 to 10 times cleaner than the Arkansas River, which is where we discharge into. We end up with a biogas, and that biogas is used to run a generator that runs one of our large treatment plants, by the way. So we use all the energy that we use is from the biogas. And then the third thing we end up with is called a biosolid, or a residual, and that's used as a great soil amendment for farmers. So that's where we're at.
All right, thank you very much. And next, Carolyn Sherman, what's your involvement in this grand process?
Well, we work closely with Raven. A lot of the people who maintain trail on the Watershed Trail and also other organizations that have worked on developing trails around the Lake Maumelle in particular, we're kind of eyes and ears out in the watershed because it's a pretty big area, and it doesn't hurt to have people out there hiking and on the water trails and just keeping an eye out for any potential harmful activity. We often report fire rings or ATV tracks where they're not supposed to be, or any other hunting activities that in areas where there isn't supposed to be hunting. We also try to keep an eye out for special projects, and we had a test case that Raven helped set up to monitor whether bicycle traffic out on the trail in the far watershed would be harmful or potentially beneficial to keep the area open. And so we participate in those activities. We also help to advocate for healthy forests, especially in the drinking watershed, Lake Maumelle, when it comes to activities with the legislature, and when it comes to various projects with other governmental agencies. We often advocate for procedures with the Division of Environmental Quality and other agencies throughout the state, the Pollution Control Board, to help maintain and monitor a healthy ecosystem so that when those drops fall, they can nourish the land and protect it so that as it goes into the lake and becomes drinking water, it's a good, healthy source.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Carolyn. And moving on to our next question tonight. We've seen a lot of growth here in Central Arkansas over the past few years, certainly in suburban areas and increasingly now more rural areas, kind of exurban areas as they're called, that were previously less developed. So the question, how has this development affected our water quality here in Central Arkansas? And what are some ways that we can help minimize that impact? And that question goes to you, Mr. Greg Ramone.
Well, the biggest issue obviously is watershed protection. And I'm sure Central Arkansas water folks would tell us where the watershed is versus where growth is may not necessarily be in the same watershed. But there's certain important things that need to be done. Obviously, stormwater runoff and how you manage stormwater runoff to make sure that you minimize pollution, grime and grease and fluids that come from cars land on the street, and then when it rains, of course, those go into drains and at some point go into some waterway. And so those type of things need to be protected. Of course, you get into trash and you get into other areas that pollute the environment, and those are the type of things. If folks are walking their dogs and they need to clean after them. So the intent is we should just be good neighbors and make sure that we're doing the things that we would normally do to keep things clean. When new growth occurs, streets get put in, infrastructure gets put in, but that also includes the storm aspect of where's the water going to drain once it lands onto the roadways.
All right, thank you very much. Next to Carolyn, the question again, how is development affecting water quality here in Central Arkansas, and how can we minimize that impact?
Well, we're looking at a lot of the same things Greg mentioned. We're concerned about subdivisions that only have a single entry point and have a lot of cul-de-sacs, because that means extra driving in those areas. And it also means that there's a lot of extra runoff from automobiles. And that's a big source of pollution as it goes into that runoff system. Another thing that we've been monitoring is that some subdivisions, as they're pushing out west into the county, are using private wastewater systems. And these have a tendency to have a short lifespan and they tend to be putting their wastewater into areas that could be floodplains. And we're concerned, while none of them right now are in the Lake Maumelle watershed, some of them are just a few feet away. And we see that as a potential danger area. We'd like to see more of those subdivisions hook up to Central Arkansas Water and to our public wastewater systems, because we know that they have the technology to treat that water and to make sure that anything that is discharged more safely than these small independent wastewater treatment systems.
Okay, thank you very much. And Raven Lawson, your thoughts?
Yeah, so we've seen a drastic shift in where people live and the ways in which people can live in these more remote areas because of COVID. I mean, we're all joining this webcast today, and it would have typically been in a auditorium hall at one of the libraries, right? And so with the ability to work from home and with the abilities to school children from home, we are seeing lots more families and groups of people who didn't traditionally live in these rural areas moving out to them. Luckily and fortunately, I can say that the development in the Lake Maumelle watershed has remained very low. We do have some new houses, but a lot of the development that we're seeing is kind of upgrading and remodeling places that are already in existence. And so that has not affected the water quality of our watershed at this time. And hopefully it hasn't, because, or won't. Some of the things that Carolyn alluded to earlier was the Lake Maumelle Watershed Task Force. So that group met over a series of years, 2005, 6, and 7, helped develop a plan to protect this landscape. And the Pulaski County Planning Commission adopted a series of subdivision ordinances and zoning codes that actually greatly limit those large scale subdivisions and the ways in which people can develop those landscapes across the watershed. And talking about what Greg said, you know, those buildings and those roads, and every time you put a hard surface where soil should be, you're increasing that runoff, you're making the water hotter, you're picking up pollutants along the way and taking them into the watershed. And those subdivision codes and ordinances help protect that greater landscape. Some ways that people can help minimize the impact on developments. We've already touched on a lot of those, but I mean, it really just starts with not littering. That's a big one that people can do. And making sure their cars are maintained, making sure that they're not pushing things down storm drains. Luckily, we don't have any storm drain influence in our drinking water watersheds here in Central Arkansas, but that is a big concern in other waterways, and everything that goes down those drains affects that water, and eventually someone drinks it. Because we discharge and we move stormwater out of Little Rock into the Arkansas River, people downstream of us do drink that water. And so it's really important to keep that on the forefront.
All right, thank you very much. And if you all are just tuning in, you're watching Issues That Matter, Protecting Arkansas Waterways, What's in Your Tap? This series is presented by the Central Arkansas Library System, the League of Women Voters of Pulaski County, and KYR 89.1. This virtual forum is being recorded for broadcast and will air at a later date on KYR. Our guests are Raven Lawson, Watershed Protection Manager with Central Arkansas Water, Greg Ramone, the CEO of the Little Rock Water Reclamation Authority, and Carolyn Sherman, a longtime watershed protection activist here in Arkansas. Moving on to our next question, I'd like to continue with this theme we've been touching on, kind of the relationship between humans and the natural world, similar to the development that we've heard impacting the water quality. We've also heard about things like cutting trees and building trails, things like that having also a negative impact on water quality here in Arkansas. So the question, are there certain things we as humans can do to change the natural environment that are actually good for water quality? And that question will go to you first, Carolyn Sherman.
Well, some of the things that we're doing as part of citizen science, and this goes beyond just drinking water watersheds, is we have some special committees that are looking at the phosphorus standards throughout the state for phosphorus as it's shed into the sedimentation of various waterways. We're also working on further plans to improve the testing for dissolved oxygen in streams and lakes, because dissolved oxygen is an important aspect of maintaining good aquatic health. We also have citizen groups that are helping to monitor the streams for E. coli and reporting on that, because certainly in the summertime, we want to send up alerts when there's too much E. coli for stream activity and lake activity. We're also encouraging lawmakers to fund projects and further research. And one of the biggest things that we feel is important is to involve children in environmental projects so that they get an early sense of the wonders of nature and want to protect it as they grow older. That to me is absolutely one of the strongest things we can do. And there are safe trails in the watersheds, especially in the Lake Maumelle watershed area, for human activity, for hiking and enjoying the lake and the views, and doing things like eagle watching, and just learning to appreciate that environment, not only for the quality of the water, but for all of the nature that surrounds it and creates that good quality water. And so those are the kinds of activities that we think help protect it for generations to come.
All right, thank you very much. The next, Raven Lawson, I know you're very involved in this topic. Again, the question, are there things we can be doing to the natural environment to help protect water quality?
Yeah, sure. And in your original question, you asked about cutting trees and making trails. And I want to make it clear that that is some of the activities that we actually do in order to extend watershed protection. The difference is when we go out and thin our overstocked forest, we're taking out very specific trees across the landscape. And in order to open up the sunlight and get it into that forest column, get it onto the forest floor, and help understory plants grow. What you see in a lot of our southern forests is that these forests are just really overstocked and they're shadowed out, and we don't have any extra plants growing underneath the big trees. And so when we cut trees, it's very systematic, it's very scientific, and we go in and select very specific ones in order to create a healthier forest and not to clear all the trees from the landscape or make better views or things like that. When it comes to trails, we also want to, as Carolyn said, we want to get people out there and we want them to appreciate the resource. If we don't have advocates for what we're doing doesn't matter, right? And so we've got to give them an avenue in which to get out there and fall in love with Lake Maumelle and appreciate those resources. So we go in and we build sustainable trails. We put them in small areas. We are very cautious of the topography that they follow and the story that they tell and where they go on the landscape. Where when others come in and just make trails, a lot of times they're going for the path of least resistance, right? So they're going straight up a hill or straight across something, and those trails are not sustainable and they fall apart over time, and they take all of the sediment and all of the soils that are in place and they push them down into our water resources. And so that's some of the differences. So you're going to hear a lot about Central Arkansas Water cutting trees and making trails, but we do it in a very specific fashion. Some things that people can do, recreate responsibly. I think is a big one. And we are seeing such a shift in the types of recreation that people are doing. I remember our governor telling people to get outside at the beginning of COVID. You know, that was one of our safe spaces, and Arkansans listened. We saw an increase in recreation like we've never seen before. And so when you are outside, know how to recreate, know the trash that you're taking, know how to get rid of it responsibly, know about fires, know about fire rings and campfires, where to camp, where not to camp, but definitely get out and enjoy those resources, because I want people to fall in love with the lake and fall in love with the work that we do. So that's just a few of the things, and that's some of the different avenues in those two topics that you can view them in.
Yes, absolutely. And Greg Ramone, your thoughts on the question?
Yeah, so Daniel, I want to change it up just a little bit. You know, keep in mind that the water that we send down the Arkansas River at some point does become someone else's drinking water. So when we look at watershed protection, we should look at it holistically. To add to one of the things Carolyn says, and a big concern, Arkansas River dumps into the Mississippi River, and when it goes into the Gulf of Mexico, there's a mess out there, and it has a lot to do with nutrients, with phosphate, with all those things, all the runoffs that occur as a result of farming, as a result of, you know, when people fertilize their lawn in the Little Rock area, the very hilly area, and all it takes is a rainstorm to really wash all that stuff into the drain, and of course into the Fush Creek, and then of course into the Arkansas River. So, you know, heavy nutrient is a problem for waterways, and it's one of the areas that we really have to look at trying to protect. I know that in many areas, farmers are getting help to try to minimize the amount of the fertilizers that they use from actually coming off of their land and going into the watershed. Obviously, they want to keep them on their land, but just as well, when folks are fertilizing their lawn, be very mindful that a lot of times a lot of that fertilizer is going to end up into the water, into the watershed that you're in. So we need to be very mindful of, and it has everything to do with people, and it has everything to do with minimizing the pollution that we cause.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, moving on to our fourth question of the evening. One of the biggest stories, really, but specifically a water story, was the rupture of the Pegasus pipeline. It's an oil pipeline passing through Mayflower, ruptured in 2013. Now it's been nearly 10 years. How did that rupture of that pipeline, how did that affect the water supply, and what is the status of the pipeline now? And that question will go to you first, Raven Lawson.
Thank you. I'm so glad to get to go first on this one. So let me tell you that the rupture did not affect a drinking water supply. It had all of the ingredients too, but it did not. And that is strictly based on the location in which it ruptured. So it ruptured in Mayflower, and it went into Lake Conway, which is not a drinking water supply. It is a recreation-based small reservoir between Conway and Mayflower. However, that pipeline, which was owned by Exxon at the time, passes through the Lake Maumelle watershed for 13 miles, and it crosses open waterways in 13 different locations within the watershed. So had that rupture happened just 8 miles south of where it did on that pipeline, we would be in hot water. Lake Maumelle alone serves 2/3 of that 500,000 Arkansan figure that I gave you earlier. And so it would have been very, very detrimental. We currently don't have a pipeline to a strong additional backup source. We can pull and treat a lot more water from Lake Winona than we currently do. Lake Winona is our original reservoir, which serves downtown. We have water rights from Lake DeGray and Greer's Ferry, and the old intake structures in the Arkansas River are still intact. But we estimate that, it would be at least 6 months before we could pull additional water from somewhere, which would put Central Arkansans in a pretty tough spot. We would have to go underwater regulations. People would have to definitely shut off their sprinklers and do lots of conservation measures to get us to that point. And then we would have to rebuild public confidence that the water that we are pulling out of the reservoir is no longer tainted. And I believe we could get there, but I don't think we would do it in that 6-month time frame because that public confidence would be pretty shot. But the current status of the pipeline, it is not currently pulling crude oil or anything to our knowledge, but PHMSA protects those groups and they can allow them to run anything through it at any time, and it can change on a whim. And they don't have to give notice or tell anyone. So it is the thing that keeps me up at night. It is the biggest single threat to our drinking water in Central Arkansas. But currently, to my knowledge, there is only nitrogen gas in those pipelines just to keep them active. They do keep up the right-of-ways, and they're constantly out there running tests and stuff. The full intention is to make them operational again, but we have a strong hope that they do not. That particular pipe was put under the ground in the 40s, and that manufactured pipe has a history of seam failure, which is what caused that rupture in Mayflower. And so it would only be a matter of time before it happened again. And probably the likelihood of it happening that close to where it did, which would be the Lake Maumelle watershed, is pretty high.
Okay, wow. So moving on to you, Greg Ramone, your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, anytime you have a pipeline that can severely cause harm to a watershed, that pipeline really has to be viewed as to, first and foremost, does it have to run through the area that it's running in? And if it does have to run, what type of protections are there that can be had? Let me say, you know, one thing about water is it doesn't compress. Well, neither does oil. And so when it doesn't compress, that means the pressure builds very quickly. So you can't just test the pipe and say, well, it's in pretty good shape. The pipe wall thickness appears to be in good condition, because you can go from, and I'm throwing out numbers. I'm not exactly sure what those pipelines, the pressure they run off on, but under under water mains are very similar. You can go from a pressure of 60 pounds to a pressure of 800 pounds or 1,000 pounds in a matter of seconds, just based on water trying to be compressed. And that would be no different with oil. So you can't assume that just because the pipeline doesn't seem like it has the corrosion and or anything else, that it won't crack or split in the process of being operated. So it is definitely a concern. It is definitely a problem for drinking water and water protection. So it really needs to be viewed longer term, and it really needs to be viewed as to how you protect a watershed from any type of contaminants like that.
Okay, thank you very much. And moving on to Carolyn, again, the question, what was the effect of the oil pipeline spill in 2013 up in Mayflower? What effect did that have on the water supply here?
I can tell you from a lot of organizations that I work with, that especially the Friends of the Watershed Trail, that we monitor the pipeline today. We get out there and hike and check it. And for those 13 points that Raven mentioned, where it engages the water system, a number of those are areas where it crosses what we affectionately call Pipeline Creek out in the outer watershed. And those tend to be gravel streams that run somewhat intermittently. And there's a lot of opportunity for that gravel to create abrasion on the pipe itself, because the pipe is not underground in those areas. And when the rupture occurred, Exxon at the time went out and tried to wrap those pipes that were above ground on Pipeline Creek, and that wrapping has now eroded away. And so we're looking at raw pipe in those areas, and we keep an eye on it. The other concern we have is that when the pipeline was built, it was designed to take a very fine mixture of sweet crude from south to north. When it ruptured, it was taking a very heavy, dense mixture from north to south. And what that means is that the pipeline was originally designed to face pressure against it going in one direction, and it is now facing the possibility of reopening and sending a very different, denser mixtures and creating pressure in areas the pipe was never designed to withstand. And that's a serious concern of ours. So we, like everybody else, are anxious for them to say that they won't use it anymore, but we can't guarantee that. And we have very little communication with the organization, PHMSA, which stands for, I can't remember, Pipe and Hazardous Materials Agency, for being able to warn us if they're going to allow it to be reopened.
And let me add that, Greg hit on a very important point. It's how would we respond? And, these things happen in the most inopportune times. But after that rupture, we did task Exxon, who no longer controls the pipeline, by the way. It is Energy Transfer Partners. But we purchased with money several sets of boom and oil response equipment, and we are prepared to respond if anything were to enter the lake. We're a little less prepared if it were to enter the river, but we do have boom and emergency response equipment, specialized small boats that can pull that boom, oil mats and things like that, that we can get out as quickly as we know something. And we work with the local emergency response agencies to make sure that those things can be deployed should we need them.
You also have at least one shutoff valve in the watershed, don't you, Raven?
Yes, I think we have 2 or 3 actually, but yeah, there is
Okay.
one that's just south of Highway 10. But if that would have to happen well before it was crossed over Highway 10, which, the lake is north of that. And so we would have to know. And that was one of the failures in the response in Mayflower, is that it took an extra long amount of time that it shouldn't have to recognize that something was going wrong and to shut those valves off. And I hope they've upgraded the equipment and the material since then, but we simply don't know.
But I think the important thing here is this should never happen. A rupture should never occur because beyond that, you're hoping everyone's doing the right thing to try to mitigate the issue, when really the problem shouldn't occur from the beginning.
All right. Well, thank you all for your insights on that and your response. If you all are just tuning in, again, you are watching Issues That Matter, Protecting Arkansas's Waterways, What's in Your Tap? This series being presented by the Central Arkansas Library System, the League of Women Voters of Pulaski County, and KYR 89.1. This virtual forum is being recorded for broadcast and will be airing at a later date on KYR 89.1. We're nearing the end of our program here. I wanted to thank you all again for joining us. To those of you watching at home, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function here on Zoom, or shoot us a comment on Facebook or YouTube if you're watching our streams over there. So moving on to our next question. It's a short and sweet one. How do we anticipate our future water needs? Very important question. What can we do now to start preparing for those future water needs? And that question goes to you, Mr. Greg Ramone.
Well, it's not a short and sweet answer. Let me just say there's there's two things that we really have to consider. The first one obviously is having the water source necessary for that 50 to 100 year horizon. But then the second component has to be, do we have the infrastructure to be able to not only treat it, but also deliver it? And depending on the amount of growth that occurs in a particular area, both water and wastewater, they go through master planning efforts. And again, the goal there is to at least plan for a 50-year horizon, and in many cases, a 100-year horizon. But also, those need to be updated periodically. So generally what happens is you put together a plan that's a 50-year plan. And then in most cases, you review it every 5 years or so to make sure that it still meets the needs and you're tweaking it the way you need to. But then on the infrastructure part, the big problem with infrastructure is we as utilities need the rates necessary to support infrastructure. And so from the point that you feel you need to do something to the point you actually do something, that could easily be 5 years. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to plan for it. You have to make sure that you do the engineering necessary for it. But then you also have to talk to the public and talk about the importance of making sure that particular infrastructure occurs. And then you need to get the funding necessary to do so. And then, of course, beyond that, you've got to get the contractor to get the work done. So it really is a long and involved process, but it's a process that water and wastewater agencies have to continually do to make sure that they're prepared for the future.
All right, thank you so much. Moving on, Carolyn Sherman, your thoughts again, the question, how do we anticipate and prepare for our needs for water in the future?
I think one of the most important things we can do is to protect our current water sources. The Lake Winona and Lake Maumelle have excellent water that requires very little treatment. And it's a super source for right now, over 500,000 people in Central Arkansas. And we have other excellent sources for the Fayetteville area and in Beaver Lake area, et cetera. But I think we just need to protect those sources so that they will last for the growth that we anticipate for the next 30 to 50 years. The other thing is, I think it's important, and I see Central Arkansas addressing this, and that is there are a lot of very small failing water systems throughout the area that they have taken over and provided water source for that are really important. And that includes the Perrin system and Perla. And they are doing a lot right now to make sure that the people in the outlying areas outside of Little Rock have good, clean source of water that will serve them for their long-term growth as well. And I think that process needs to continue.
All right,
Yeah.
and Lawson, your thoughts.
So, man, they had really good answers. But yeah, one of the things that we do is, we do look at things regionally, as Carolyn alluded to, and looking at population trends and water usage. We're really fortunate right now where we sit that climate change is actually in our favor for giving us more water than we need, which is not the case in places like Greg came from in Arizona and California and things like that. So we are looking at climate change from a polarizing extremes, but we are trending on wetter here. So I don't think in the immediate term our water sources are going to be threatened from a water quantity perspective. But as Carolyn said, we definitely want to protect those from a water quality perspective. And we have to think on that 100-year time frame. It takes a lot of time to protect water sources. And both of our reservoirs were constructed by building dams and damming up rivers and creating those. And we don't do that anymore. I mean, there's a great movement across the US and even in Arkansas to remove small dams and reopen waterways. But in a lot of cases, those are the water sources. So when we've got a good water source, we've got to protect it so that we're being proactive and not reactive. Greg also mentioned, having the rate structure and the fees in place in order to do these things. At Central Arkansas Water, we were one of the first in the country to adopt a watershed protection fee that is a line item on your bill. And that money goes directly into acquiring lands and putting conservation easements on those lands to help with that 100-year time frame that we're looking at. So another thing that people just don't think about when they get a water bill and they do see rates go up is what really goes into that. We have a very slim staff of 325 people, and people would think that that's large, but it takes every single one of us working day in and day out to make sure that people get their water. And when a water main breaks near your house or your water is shut off for some reason, you rely on people to get out there and fix that problem. And that takes gas, which is now $3.50 a gallon, to mobilize those big trucks and that equipment. It takes multiple people to get there. And we have to think about that all the way from that point, all the way back to where the water came from. And so we've got to remember that the rates that we put into place, we're not for-profit entities here in Arkansas. There are some for-profit water delivery systems, but we're not. And that's the money that it really takes to make sure that public health is sustained through the drinking water. So please bear with us when you do see changes in rate structures, because we have to keep up with inflation too.
And Daniel, can I just add to what Raven said? It's very important. If you own a house, you have to maintain the house, and you have to make sure that your pipes are good, that your roof is good, that your air conditioner is good. Well, it's no different with the water and wastewater system. I tell folks that they own a $1 billion system. And when you look at having to maintain that system, it takes effort and it takes money. And even if it means you replace that system in 100 years, that means that the pipes that are in the ground now, you expect them to last 100 years. That's still a 1%. That's 1% that it costs per year for us to be able to do that. And so it's expensive. And in order to keep reliability high, we need to continue to invest into the system.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for your response. Got a number of questions from viewers here. I'm going to move on to those right after this question. And this is kind of a good summation, I think, of what we've been talking about here today. Ultimately, who is responsible for protecting our water supply, and what are some things that everyone can do or not do to help with that? And I will go to you first, Carolyn.
Well, obviously, I believe in it pretty strongly. I do believe that there's plenty of room for citizen activism and citizen science in protecting a lot of watersheds throughout the state. And as I said before with an earlier question, I really believe that this belongs to our future and our young people. And so I think we have to involve them in a lot of appreciation, but also in protecting the waterways with projects, environmental projects. And I also think that it's important for programs like this to educate people into how we have an abundance of wonderful water here, but we have to continue to protect it. I try to review various permits that come up before the Division of Environmental Quality to see if any of them might negatively impact water quality. I also review bills that go before Congress. I think that's an important aspect, and if necessary, we lobby for better protections from our legislature, and try to stay on top of the various activities that are going on throughout the state in terms of water alliances and water protection agencies.
Okay, moving on to you, Raven.
Yeah, so anyone who relies on safe water for consumption. So that's all of us, right? So it really goes down to it's everyone's job and responsibility. And I would just task everyone with saying, the first step that you can do is just to educate yourself about one, where your water comes from, and also the waters that you recreate in, and realize that once your feet are in wet and you're standing in those waterways, don't stand in Lake Mom Health's against the rules, but other waterways, when you are at the water's edge, that is not where water quality starts. And so look up and look at that landscape, because that's where the protection comes in. Once the water is gathered in those reservoirs and in those resources, it is what it is. And so when you are camping or you are out hiking and enjoying our natural resources, know that your footsteps and everywhere that you are touching and all of that impacts that nearest waterway. And so you become part of that watershed. And so anything that you do has the ability to change the water quality. And so knowing what the nearest water body is and what those watershed boundaries are and where you're located in that grand scheme of things is really important. But I would encourage everyone listening, if you do not get a bill from Central Arkansas Water, hopefully you now know where your water comes from. But if you don't get a bill from us, find out who and where your water source is. My house is just north of Conway, and my water comes all the way from Greer's Ferry Lake to my home. And the people right across the highway from me get their water much more locally than I do in my home. And so it's important to know where your water comes from and to educate yourselves on how to read the water quality reports that the utilities put out, because that will make you more empowered to make decisions and to do those steps that Carolyn talked about that are on a much higher level with advocacy, education, and activism.
All right. And Greg Ramone, again, the question, who's responsible for protecting the water supply and what can everyone do to help or stop doing to help?
Well, obviously, everyone's responsible. Trash is a terrible thing to be on the ground, and it should be disposed of properly. Water utilities throughout the country are now dealing with such things as microplastics, as an example. But more importantly, again, each one of us has a responsibility, and regardless of where we're at, whether we're at home or whether we're vacationing or whether we're going to the store, we should be mindful of that. But I want to bring up just a couple of other things that folks generally don't think about. Obviously, if you take your dog out, make sure you clean after your dog. But what people don't understand, they think that when they're done with these medications, these pills, they just dump them into the toilet, and or they have this big drawer full of medications that they don't use. And the bottom line is never, ever, ever dispose of them into the toilet. Don't put any kind of chemicals. The wastewater reclamation facilities are not designed to remove those things. So they end up going into the Arkansas River, and they end up becoming somebody else's drinking water. And so be very mindful of that stuff. Be very mindful of the fertilizers that you use. Those are the type of things that become a huge impact to waterways. And so I think if we all do our part, we have really healthy waterways and we can all enjoy them. And at the end, they last for many, many generations.
And one that goes overlooked so often is maintaining your septic systems. If you have a septic system, be responsible and make sure that it is cleaned out on a regular basis. That is one of the biggest things that you can do at your local home impact to protect the watershed that you live in. So maintain your septic systems.
Or connect to the sewer system.
Or connect to the sewer system. That's an even better option. That's a much better option.
Yes, I just wanted to say in what you were talking about, Greg, the prescription drugs. I know I don't know exactly what day of the year it is, but I know there's Prescription Drug Take Back Day. I think at least.
If you don't mind, I'm also a Rotary Club 99 member, and I'm responsible for the drug take back portion. It's twice a year. It's generally the end of April and the end of October, and it is a tremendous opportunity to take all the medications that you have, both over the counter and prescription, and dispose of them properly. let me just say the impact that it has to families, when you start to look at it statistically, lots of drug issues occur because of home prescriptions.
There you go. Well, be on the lookout for that. Well, we are nearing the end of our talk here today. I want to thank you all again so much for joining us here, providing your insights. We have a number of questions from our audience here. I'm going to just run through them. We don't have to keep going round robin style, just whoever wants to answer, as long as you want to answer. I'm going to try to run through all these. And again, y'all have been very generous with your time. If you have to leave, I completely understand. Thank you very much for that. But I'm going to start with a question from Carol Trana. I hope I'm saying that correctly. This is a question I actually had, and I think I asked it to you, Raven. Could you tell us what the physical borders of the watershed are?
Yes, so that is hard to define without a map. But if you look behind me at this picture, those ridge lines that you see all the way around, basically, if you are hiking up to the top of Pinnacle Mountain and you look down, all of the ridge lines that you could see, if you imagine them like a cereal bowl and you're pouring water around the edges, if you can imagine the water going off of those ridge lines and coming down into the reservoir, that is part of the watershed. The Lake Maumelle watershed is 88,000 acres. So it's not just the borders of the lake. It is really those ridge lines all the way out there, and every one of those water drops that roll off the fronts of those mountainsides and start heading downhill have the potential to impact the water quality of the watershed. So watersheds are defined geographically. They're not defined by political borders or state boundaries or anything like that. So to understand how big your watershed is, you really have to look at a map. But the EPA has resources for that. So you can go, I think it's Map My Watershed, and you can find out, you can type your, or I think there's also a My Watershed zip code, and you can type your zip code in and it'll show you the watershed that you live in and what those boundaries are, and show you just how expansive some of them can be.
All right. And this is kind of going off of, I remember you saying that you can't stand in a certain lake because it is a water source, but we have a question. How unusual is it for a major water source like Lake Maumelle to be available for recreational use? And that's, I guess, kind of delineated. You can't swim in it, but you can, take your boat out on it. Does that help protect the watershed?
Yeah, there's different forms of thought here. Like, for instance, San Diego's water supply has a 12-foot chain link fence all the way around it. You have to be, even as a watershed protector, I have to be escorted by an armed guard to go in their fence. And so there are lots of watersheds across the US that are fenced out to keep people out, no recreation. For us, we look at compatible uses that we feel are very low impact to water quality changes. And so, the school of thought's all over. I come from a very strong background of appreciating natural resources and therefore wanting to protect them. So I think that we should have them open to those compatible uses so that we can get people out and we can get people to fall in love with them. But there's schools of thought across the US that are more open than us and much more closed than us, and lots of in-betweens.
Okay, and moving on to our next question from the audience. What is our water capacity within the resources we have currently? And are we using more than is being replenished or recycled or reclaimed each year? I know, Greg, you were saying that all the water we have is all the water we will have. So kind of how does that fit in there?
Well, it's, with water resources, obviously, and I think Raven could probably speak more to the capacity that's at the Maumelle Lake, as well as how much water is being drawn from it. Again, we're very fortunate here because it rains a lot. Other parts of the country are not. In Phoenix, it's got two different water sources: the Colorado River and the Salt River. And at one point, one of them may be in a drought, or both of them may be in a drought. And under those conditions, then and many cities throughout the country have this, where you can only water your lawn every other day or once a week or so forth. So the whole concept is to make sure that you're managing your water resources and you're not depleting them. I mean, that's at the end, that's the most important thing.
I'll say that we do have plenty of capacity for a much larger population than we currently serve. So we're not at threat of needing to go under those restrictions or depleting the resources. It's replenished as fast as we use it. We have continuous water coming into the system. So we're not under threat currently, but we don't know what the future holds.
Well, kind of going off of that theme of conserving water, even though, as you said, we're in good shape, but always good to conserve. Do you have to use drinking quality water for things like watering your lawn or your garden, or is there an alternative source?
Can I take that one, Daniel? So in Phoenix, every drop of water has an owner behind it, and there is no extra water. And a lot of the turf irrigation is done with recycled water, and the opportunity to do that is tremendous. I mean, obviously, drinking water is really established to drink. That's what it's for, and it's treated for that reason. Obviously, it's also used for fire protection, but we use it for a lot of other things. We use it for irrigation. We use it for lots of stuff. But the reality is, many parts of the country, reuse water is an extremely important portfolio in their water scheme. So no, you don't need to use drinking water to water your lawns. The drawback is that you've got to have the infrastructure to get other types of water out there.
You've got small at-home gardens, a rain barrel will get you pretty far. Any rain that you can harvest and use on your own site is probably most ideal for lawns and gardens, and it does help with conservation, and it keeps it in the system, and it's cheap. Although drinking water is very cheap, we need less and less people drinking bottled water. You're throwing your money away because bottled water is just someone else's treated drinking water. So even though you think you may be conserving your water locally, you're really doing yourself a disservice and your wallet a disservice when you drink bottled water.
Absolutely.
I'd like to put in a plug for native plants that are more drought tolerant, and also they keep a lot of our environment for butterflies, hummingbirds, and natural species. So I think the more we can do to make sure that our lawns are efficient and using native species, that's a good thing.
From a watershed perspective, all our restoration efforts go into increasing native plant capacity across our landscapes, because those native plants have much larger root systems than any of our turf grasses. Your turf grass, you go out to your lawn and you pluck it up and it's got a root system that's maybe an inch or two. Our native plant root systems are between 5 and 15 feet on average, and all of those root systems help filter the water as it runs across the landscape, because a lot of the things that we want to keep out of our water, the nutrients that can cause so many problems, those plants can use those nutrients. And so they help slow down the water on the landscape, they help filter the water, and all of those roots hold the soils in place. And when you've got a reservoir like Lake Maumelle that only averages 25 feet deep across the reservoir, all the dirt that falls down the hill adds up and can fill in that resource. And so we really advocate for native plants across the system, not only in your yards, but also out in our native landscapes as well.
All right, sounds good. Well, I'm going to fold these two final questions from our audience into one big one. And again, anyone who wants to answer, feel free. First part, is there any leaching of contaminants into our water supply or our watershed from landfills? And the second part, had the Perla water system failed? I believe that's a small town here in Arkansas. If that system had failed, could that have affected us in the Little Rock area? So kind of a two-part unrelated question, but whoever wants to answer, feel free.
Okay, I'll take it. So the first part was, do we have any landfill leaching for our drinking water supply? And the answer is no. And we're really fortunate at Lake Maumelle that we are only one of 2 reservoirs or 2 water bodies in the entire state that have a prohibition on direct discharge contamination. So that means that there is no no factories or no sewage treatment or anything that has a pipe leaking into the watershed. The other one is the Buffalo National River that we talked about at the beginning of this show. To that regard, we also don't have any landfills or anything affecting our drinking water here in central Arkansas. And the other PERLA, the failure of the PERLA system is one of regionalism. And so while it would not have affected our water quality or water quantity or water supply at Central Arkansas Water, we feel it's our duty to step in with the expertise and the staffing and the resources that we have to help those failing systems. So really the only impact is that of our staffing, some financial, although that one comes with a lot of grant funding and help from the state to help us help them. But the failure of the system specifically would not have affected water quality.
But I do want to add to what Carolyn said, when you've got small package plants and or a system that has failed, it does pollute the area that it's in. So although it may not pollute Little Rock, unfortunately, that's the cause of not running a system properly or maintaining it.
All right. Well, thank you all again so much for coming out tonight, sharing your ideas with us. It's been a very illuminating conversation. This concludes tonight's forum. This has been the latest panel in our Issues That Matter series. Please share your comments on this forum and ideas for future forums. You can find us on social media. You can also email comments at ualrpublicradio.org. You can also, again, hit us up on social media for the Central Arkansas Library System, the League of Women Voters of Pulaski County, and KYR. And again, this panel will air at a later date here on KYR 89.1. Keep your eyes open for information on that, as well as our next discussion in our Protecting Arkansas's Waterways series. That's going to be called A Deep Dive into Adventure. Sounds thrilling. That's going to be on May 26th at 6:30 p.m. again. Well, on behalf of the Central Arkansas Library System, the League of Women Voters of Pulaski County, and KYR 89.1, thank you all again for attending. And thank you and good night.
Good
Thank you.
evening.
It was a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much, guys. Appreciate it.